Welcome to the Myth and Magic Authors Podcast, folklore and fantasy topics aimed at creative storytellers. To write stories and challenge your brain with exciting ideas, delve into these presentations and reflections. See how fantasy realms are based on actual world history, legend, and lore. Study fairy tales, nature fables, and supernaturalism to engage in a jumble of concepts that will trigger your fancy and get you writing imaginatively. Now, here's your host, Neil Mack.
Hello, fantasy fiction fans, and welcome to Myth and Magic, the podcast for fantasy creatives everywhere. And this week I'm speaking to Jon DiSavino. Jon's performed on stages from New York City to Hong Kong. His acting credits include appearances at the Lincoln Center, the Brooklyn Academy of Music, and the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. His directing credits span a range of plays, which include Shakespeare and musicals, and Noel Coward, and he staged productions in New York City, San Francisco, and the greater Boston area. But in January this year, Jon launched a weekly podcast, and it's titled Short Story Today, and it combines his love of performance with his love of literature. So in this interview, I talked about creating and reading out modern stories, and I also discussed with him podcast narration, audiobook narration, voiceover work, dialects, acting, directing, narrating. So it's very, very interesting and exciting interview. And so without further ado, let's go over to the professional actor and podcast producer and host, Jon DiSavino. Hello, Jon. Lovely to see you.
You too. Where are you?
So I'm based in near Windsor Castle. I live on the River Thames and about 7 miles from Windsor. So we're on the west of London. Have you been to this area?
I have been to London. I am an Anglophile, from way back. So.
Yeah, I kind of guessed that. Yeah.
Yeah, being an actor and, very tapped into the tradition in England, Shakespeare and all the other, writers that in his orbit. So I'm excited to have this conversation with you from across the pond, as they say.
And where are you based?
I'm in New York on the Hudson River Valley, just about maybe 40 minutes outside of Manhattan. So.
Okay. Yeah. I know New York reasonably well. I've done the New York Marathon a couple of times.
Yeah, me too. I did it once. I worked for the Roadrunners Club that puts it on every year. 100 years ago. I won't even say what year that was, but
well, let me put it this way: I stopped running when I was 40, so that gives you a clue.
Okay. Yeah, well, you're a better man than I am, Neil. And I stopped when I was about 25. So.
Okay. And I've driven around the whole of New York State, and it's something that not many of my fellow countrymen have done. So I've travelled to Syracuse, Albany. I've been all the way up, obviously, to the Canadian border and that. So I know the state pretty well, and I love and the Catskill Mountains.
You have a place to crash the next time you come out here.
That's very nice. Thank you.
I love that Stephen Fry did that series where he drove that old British clunker around the country. Did you catch any of that?
I saw one or two. Yeah. I love that sort of thing. I love road trips anyway, and I specifically love road trips in your country. I've done road trips around Europe as well, but there's no doubt about it. The United States has the best geography and the best people.
Oh well, that's kind of you to say. We have our differences clearly here in the States. Yeah. So you have so many places you may want to steer clear of, obviously. But we won't get into that. We're going to stay as far away from politics as possible in this conversation.
That might be a good idea. Yeah, we're going to concentrate mostly on talking about writers and reading. Yes. And as you know, this is a program which we talk a lot about fantasy in particular, because it's myth and magic.
Right.
But I really wanted to kind of start, because I think it's only fair to start with your entry in and your journey into performance and into drama, because that's really what you're famous for.
Oh, well.
So let's go with there to start with.
Sure. Well, I have a good story as far as that goes, and there's some British connections there too, actually, indirect. But I was a high school student, a very shy high school student. My junior year, they always did a big musical at the high school every year, and my English teacher happened to be the person who directed the musical, and he obviously saw something in me and thought that I might be a good Oliver in Oliver Twist, not Oliver. The musical Oliver, he thought that I would be a good Artful Dodger. Right. So he recommended that I come and audition, and that was like the furthest thing I could imagine myself doing. Yeah. So he literally had to kind of push me down to the audition, and it was not easy for me. It was very uncomfortable, but he called me back. And there was an upperclassman, a senior, who was also called back for the Artful Dodger. And I watched his call back from in the dark all the way in the last row of the 1,400-seat auditorium at the high school, and saw, this very poised and, gifted person performing. He was like a folk singer. This was back in days of hippies. Yeah. And he was sort of a, hippie folk singer, and was, he was incredible. And I thought, I can't go up against this guy. So I did not show up for my callback audition, but I did get cast as one of Fagin's boys, and I had like 2 little lines. So that was the start for me. I got hooked. That experience just got me completely hooked on doing theater.
Well, you saw my expression then of shock, because I joined a stage school when I was 5, and one of my first roles really was one of the I think they called them mud splashers or something in the Oliver musical. So wonderful. That's a great story to start with. But what about books and poems? Did you ever perform or read out any books or poems, especially your own work, to an audience? Can you?
No, I can't say that I've read my own work. I may have read a poem of mine in high school in front of the class. I'm sure I don't recall that, okay, specifically, but I must have, because I wrote them, as assignments, and we always had to read them. Yeah. But it's funny, I always was called upon to read books if we had like open reading in the classroom, where, students could volunteer to read from the book. The teachers knew what my proclivities were, so they always kind of called on me to read things, especially if there were like characters, with accents or things like that in the book.
Right. So how old were you when you were doing accents, do you think?
I was born a mimic, I have to say.
Really?
I see home movies of when I was a child, and I never stopped moving. And I could imitate people from day one. That was something, I don't know, I just had that gift as a child. Yeah. And so it just kind of naturally evolved into, being able to listen and hear accents and replicate them. So that's become kind of a specialty of mine. I've coached actors and stage productions with accents and dialects. So that's something that I take a lot of particular interest in. So
how did you move from amateur production then into more professional production?
Well, I went to a conservatory program, Carnegie Mellon University, which is a pretty well-respected, well-regarded theater program. I didn't get a master's degree there, but they do have a master's program. Okay. But it's a fine arts degree. So I was focused on getting a classical training right from the outset, and it was always my intention that once I graduated, I was going to move to New York and start looking for work and try to make my way as an actor. But the realities of that hit me hard in the face once I moved to New York and saw, what it meant to try to fight, you're to the top of crowds of literally thousands of young people trying to make it. And it's no different in England and London, I'm sure, that challenge of trying to rise above the fray somehow. So, but I'm going to kind of diverge a little bit, because emotional challenge of that to me was so intense and kind of traumatic that I didn't do very well as an actor, initially. And I kind of had to step back and think about, I'm clearly not going to go that route with acting. So, I'll have to think about other ways to work at it from like maybe around the sides or something, and that was kind of a lifelong journey doing that sort of thing, which eventually led me to what I'm doing right now. So I don't know if I really went off too much on a tangent there, but I tried to connect with with your question there. But yeah, it's very hard to make it as an actor, and I was not prepared emotionally for the constant rejection of that. So
yeah, I understand. I think all authors who are listening to this understand, because we face rejection. We're artists, and we are writing stuff that we really believe in and we're passionate about, and it burns from our heart. And then to be rejected by somebody who, is just non-entity is a very hard thing to deal with. A total stranger
is rejecting you. It's like it's very hard to square that in your mind,
And worse than that, it's if you're an actor, or if you're a painter, or if you're a musician, or if you're an author, you're writing for a particular person, a recipient on the other side. You're not writing for the judge. And so this person, this judge, this evaluator, has stepped in between you, the person who's writing the message, and the recipient, the other end. That's how I.
Yes, and you can't always even be sure that they're qualified to be able to make that kind of a decision. That they have a job to do, and I mean, you trust that they know what they're doing, but I think often that's not the case.
No, often they're just a gatekeeper who's employed to stop people coming through that.
Right. Yeah. And I've noticed in doing and working on this podcast, and I'm focused primarily on writers with my podcast, which I know we'll get back to.
We do.
But yeah, I can completely identify with the writer's plight in having to find a way out, into a place where people can read your work, or be even aware of your existence. The problems and concerns are very much the same as what actors deal with, and all across all of the arts, all the disciplines. And that's why parents always say, "Are you sure you don't want to be an accountant, or a lawyer, or a doctor,
or fit exhaust pipes?"
Yes, work for the government. They'll
work for the
care.
IRS. That's good.
They'll take care of you. It's like the appeal is just not the same, obviously. But
it's interesting to talk to you, because we've talked to film director on the program. We've got a film composer next week, but it makes you realize as an author how everybody is connected to one another. This is an interconnected business, isn't it?
Oh my goodness, it is so, and that is not lost on me right now. I'm realizing more than ever the connectedness of. Well, I mean, because you're working in a community, clearly, but the interconnectedness sometimes will just shock you at how it feels like you're being guided sometimes to connect with certain people. It's just too significant and profound. But it's coincidence. I'm not one who believes in fate and destiny. Now, you being immersed in mysticism, and speculative, you may feel differently, but for me, I have to kind of revisit that every day, because I feel like the connections are too much of a coincidence sometimes. So to that point, the connectivity part is a very profound part of this experience for me.
Thank you for touching on the magic then. That's very helpful. It helps me with my next question, which is about what kind of authors have turned you on. What authors do you chill out to? And do any of those write speculative fiction?
Well, now I'm so immersed in short stories that I don't even have that much time to read novels, but I have been a fan of fiction from day one. I mean, I learned to read at a very young age, and I started out reading things like Mutiny on the Bounty. I think I was in my sick bed at like 7 or 8 years old and reading things like Mutiny on the Bounty. Yeah. So I mean, I really have a very strong attraction to the classics, and I feel like, until I've read that canon, it's like I feel almost guilty kind of venturing out into contemporary stuff, although I've gotten over that, and I love contemporary stuff, and I love people like Neil Gaiman, and the things that he writes, or steers people to. His stuff, I find really fascinating, because he takes it to another level where, as I'm sure you know, because you're in that world, there's fantasy and mystery, that's being written on a particular level for the popular consumption, which is fine, and I'm sure it's enjoyable. But then there's people like Neil Gaiman who raise the bar and create things that really kind of cross genres and are of a standard that people who wouldn't necessarily be drawn to that genre will read that because of people like him, and the attention that he's brought to it.
Yeah, I know. I agree. I understand in my head that Shakespeare was a bit of a fantasist. And
yes,
the reason I'm thinking about that is because the ghosts keep coming out.
I love that question. That was one I was hoping you would come to, because I obviously, I mean, not necessarily. There are a lot of American actors who probably are a little intimidated by Shakespeare. Not me. I mean, Shakespeare is hugely popular here. There's Shakespeare festivals all across this country that are, people throng to every summer, and during the year too. But I think American actors really have an inferiority complex when it comes to Shakespeare and the British tradition of acting Shakespeare. It's hard not to, I have to say. There are great American actors who do really wonderful performances of Shakespearean roles, but it's very hard not to be cowed a little bit when you see people like Ralph Fiennes, people of his stature doing Shakespearean roles. But getting back to your question about the fantasism in Shakespeare, and I adore that in him, and always look for that in his plays and in productions of his plays, to see how directors choose to embody that in the play, because you can go in all different directions with that. You can really go full bore, or you can kind of dial it back and try to just be subtle with that. But that's why a play like A Midsummer Night's Dream or The Tempest, for me, those are the holy grail. I just directed A Midsummer Night's Dream several years ago, and had such a good time, because that's where Shakespeare gets to really flex all of his muscles and combines all of those elements, the things that he does best, and then he throws in all of the myth and the fantasy elements. And in other plays, it's very serious. The ghosts that appear to Hamlet, and in Macbeth, or the Scottish play. Excuse me. Not gonna. I have to go out and turn around three times. Those are meant to really make you stop in your tracks and put fear in you. But in things like The Tempest and The Midsummer Night's Dream, it's all about the fun and the silliness, that can be gleaned from the world of the fairies and the forest, the denizens of the forest there, and that for a director and for an actor, I think is so much more entertaining. There are demands in the other plays where I don't know if you would call it entertaining to try to get to the heart of those characters. It's hard work, whereas it's just pure fun when it comes to the Tempest and the Midsummer Night's Dream.
But it also makes you realize that the playwright knew that he could get away with stuff that he couldn't get away with in history or even tragedy, because he was able to expand the possibilities of belief. He could test those.
Yes, and he knew that his audience, in the case with those plays, would be willing to just go completely with whatever he was going to put out there. It was all about the fun and the joy of the experience.
So am I right in thinking you've not attempted to write your own play, or have you done that?
I have, I have experimented. I'm too timid. I need to get over my fear of, being laughed at, I guess. I have written, I've begun to write plays, and then the critical inner voice has kind of said, I don't know if this is really what you should be doing. And then I've kind of backed away from them. But I have so many little bits of things that I've started, and pages of notes and outlines of things that I've wanted to work on. I'm a big musical theater fan, so that's something that I've always wanted to play a part in, writing a musical. And I'm always thinking about what could be adapted into a musical. That's a game that I always play with myself when I'm reading anything or watching something. I think, this could make a really good musical. So, I intend, before my time is done on this planet, to do a little more delving into that and see where it might take me. But, for now, I have other things on my plate. So.
Okay. So what's your critical inner voice telling you to do now then?
Well, I have gotten very good at shutting that critical inner voice.
Oh, good.
As an old guy with some life experience, it's funny. I'm in my 60s, and I really feel like it took me that long. I'm a late bloomer. I've always been a late bloomer. It took me that long to figure out, that you can really do the things that those critical inner voices are telling you might not be able to do.
Yeah.
And they really need to just shut up and and go back into the shadows and allow you to do what you want to do. And so I'm doing that. I took kind of an odd path to where I am right now, but I feel like this is what I was always meant to do, which is a really wonderful thing to wake up to every day. And I get to use all my skills and all my strengths, are put to work in this project that I'm doing.
Okay, you better tell us about the project then.
Yeah, the project, I have a podcast called Short Story Today, which I started out as just a way of continuing to exercise my acting skills. I do audiobooks. I've done several, and I produce and do the performance of the books. I got kind of tired of having to read things that other people wanted me to read, which weren't always of the highest quality. I mean, they could be fun to read. I just felt, boy, I'm so enjoying reading these books. Just the act of creating these characters. It's every actor's dream. You get to play all the parts. That part is enormously fun. Wouldn't it be nice to do some of the things that I really would choose to read for myself? So that's where I got the idea of the podcast. And I knew it would, short stories fit the form so beautifully. You could choose stories that might, be read in 15 to 30 minutes and would make a really lovely little afternoon break. Just, at a lunch break, you could listen to one of these things, and, it would be something enjoyable. And for me, I would feel it would be an enormous honor for me to be able to provide that entertainment for people. And then once I got into this project and started to reach out, I used Twitter as, the place where I really try to engage the community and get some interest in things. And it really, the writing community on Twitter is a very positive place as opposed to a lot of the other corners of Twitter. The writing community is very supportive. So just kind of, it seemed like a natural place for me to gravitate on Twitter. And as I did that and started to communicate with writers, I found that they were having difficulties with in getting their work out, getting it accepted, all the rejections, very similar to what we were talking about earlier, being rejected at auditions, being rejected, having your queries, I mean, I don't know the ins and outs in particular of what it is to be a writer and try to get your work accepted, but I certainly know the frustrations that people are experiencing. So what I started out with in my podcast was just reading things that I could read without concern about the copyright. So I was reading stories in the public domain, which for our country means stories 100 years old, or older. So, but that isn't to say that there isn't an enormous wealth of material for me to work from. It's just that it's old, short story today was not really about stories of today. I'm reading stories today, but they're not, they're stories from yesterday. And they may, resonate with people today because, the human experience and, what people were writing about then, a lot of that really hasn't changed in 100 years. And yet, these are not contemporary stories. So the idea of being able to read contemporary stories and at the same time provide a service to the writers by, helping them get the word out, helping bring exposure to them in their work, that just, the light bulb went off in my head. And I thought, this is where I need to go from here. So now on May 11th, we're going to debut the new version of the podcast, Short Story Today, where we're going to showcase the work of emerging writers. I'm going to get a chance to actually interview living writers. I couldn't ask the dead ones questions.
No, it's annoying. You can't speak to Virginia Woolf now, can you?
No. As much as I would, oh my God, what I wouldn't give to be able to speak to Virginia Woolf.
Yeah.
She got 2 stories from me on the early version of the podcast because I couldn't leave her with one. I had to do a second one. But yeah, I mean, when I think about all the questions I would have wanted to ask writers like Virginia Woolf, but as you said, that's not possible. So this is going to be so much fun. I've already started interviewing them, and once we get started, I am going to be very curious to see the reaction to this. I'm really hoping that this, strikes a chord or hits a nerve, however you want to put it, with the writing community out there and generates some buzz so we can get these writers some serious attention because they certainly deserve it. I'm being very selective. I'm only, I comb through literary journals every day looking for the best of the best.
Right.
And I've been extremely lucky to find some incredibly gifted people who I am so excited to be able to try to help on their journey. And some of them are young, in their 20s, and some of them have been doing this for decades and have written anthologies and, have just not, they certainly have respect in the community, but they haven't really broken out in the way that I feel they deserve. Anyway, as you can tell, I'm very excited about the prospects of, what I might be able to do to help people with this podcast.
Well, it sounds really exciting, and it's obviously a very creditable thing to be doing and helping the community. You're going to be acting a little bit as a gatekeeper then, because you're going to have to judge who's good and who's not good, and the way you're doing it sounds like a very sensible and scientific way of doing that. Once again, I fully applaud that. But we've got in this country a tradition of listening to stories because we've got the BBC Radio 4, the plays on the radio. Obviously, then we went into listening to books, talking book, which are taped.
Yes.
And then eventually onto audiobooks, which is more like the Amazon sells.
Right.
How important do you think it is that authors read out their work or have their work read out? Because to me, it's a fundamental part of storytelling, but I just wanted to see what your perspective was.
Yeah, I was kind of on the fence at first about audiobooks. The concept is great, but for me, the joy of reading is just that, reading. The joy of books, I should say, is in the reading of the books.
Yeah.
And being able to go back, a couple of sentences and go, wait a minute, let me reread that because I'm not sure I got the full gist of it. You can't do, and this is what I've learned as a performer of audiobooks.
Right.
Things go back by quite rapidly, and you don't have the luxury of going back. I mean, you do, but it's, people are not going to necessarily take the time and rewind, Yeah. I mean, if they're really stuck on something, they might, but it's a completely different experience listening to an audiobook as opposed to reading a book. And it has its purpose and its value. I totally get that. But for me, I don't find it as enjoyable. It's ironic that I do it, and I do it and get paid to do it. But I would always prefer to pick up a book and read it rather than listen to someone else reading it to me. It's a different, and it takes I think it's a different part of your brain that's engaged too when you're listening to a story as opposed to reading it off the page. So, I as you can tell, I have mixed feelings about it.
Yeah, that's interesting. You're right that you don't have the ponder moment if you're listening to the book, do you? But there are lots of examples of storytelling being spoken. Yeah, the spoken history of the Jewish people, for example, is as a spoken history. It's a retelling, and this concept in my mind of a storyteller being the oldest craft person, whatever tribe you belong to, that person who could sit by the fire and tell you the story of your tribe and the history of your tribe,
your ancestors
and your gods or whatever. They're the ones which held this story inside their head and then explained it to you. So there is certainly an important part of the story development, which is
absolutely
retelling.
Yes, and in that regard, hopefully that tradition still exists in the world. I mean, from what I can gather, it does. In the Native American community here, and in other like pre-literate cultures, which still exist.
The other thing about audio is that it's more immersive, possibly. I'm not saying it is for everybody, but I do feel sometimes if you're listening to a really good audio presentation, the kind of stuff that you're doing, it tends to feel like it's inside you. It actually inhabits you in a way that perhaps a book doesn't, because you have got that. There's a slight gap between you and the words.
Yes. No, I think that's a good point. And I think a lot of that does come down to who's reading it. And I hate to sound, like I'm, promoting my own shtick here, but it runs the gamut out there. The quality of what you hear on audiobooks, it really makes a huge difference, I should say, who's reading the story, whether it's going to immerse you in that way and engage you on that level. And that's why books that are national bestsellers pick the cream of the crop when it comes to the people who are going to narrate or perform audiobooks. So, but the irony is that just because you're a movie star doesn't necessarily make you a great audiobook reader. And I've really been shocked at how mediocre a lot of the movie stars' versions of audiobooks, major books, have turned out to be. Very disappointing. And I can't blame them, because as an audiobook reader and producer, I understand that the requirements are very different. It's a very different kind of acting is required for audiobooks. And your attention has to be on a lot of different things at once, as opposed to acting on the stage or in a film where, you're kind of focused, you're the character and you're kind of focused on what your part is in the big picture, as opposed to, you have to kind of be a director and an actor at the same time when you're narrating an audiobook. It's kind of like you have the canvas there, you have to make it all come together for the listener in a way. And if you're doing multiple voices, the challenges are very different. it's counterintuitive and I think sometimes counterproductive that they go first to these big stars, thinking that they're going to be the ones who are going to help them sell the audiobook.
Yeah.
But they might end up with an inferior product as a result of that.
That's true.
So, it's just the kind of the blind spots of the industry,
Yeah, I agree.
I
get a feeling that if you walk onto a stage, say, for example, you're working in Stratford-on-Avon and you walk onto the stage to do the Scottish play, the lights are on you, everybody's gasp waiting for you to speak, and you sort of like stand there in your stance, and you do your roar to start with. Obviously, that's a completely different type of acting to the nuance that you're probably trying to just get across. That tiny difference in the end of a sentence that you're going to be doing in an audiobook.
Yes, and in the editing, because I produce them too. In the editing, I hear things over and over again. I'm very exacting about making sure that the meaning is the exact meaning behind what was written is there. And that the inflection, the intonation, I'm trying to channel the author, and I really want to make sure that I am satisfied that I am getting the meaning to the nth degree that the writer is intending. So I really go through it with a fine-tooth comb and do redubs and edits to make sure that it is exactly what I would hope to hear if I were the person picking this up and listening to it for the first time.
And when you're doing the middle part, the description, what you might call in opera the recitative, the bits which are, he walked into the door and he said, what voice do you adopt for that? Because that's the author's voice, or
it's very interesting. I really could write a book about this stuff. I should think about it. There are, but I think I really do have some things to say about this. But that can change. It can be a very neutral voice. It really depends on the book or the story. It could be a very neutral voice. Typically, it would be. If it's a third-person narrative, it's an omniscient voice. And, you want to just keep that neutral. And then, the characters come in and they're, they kind of raise the level of things. But the narrator, like I read as one of the stories on the podcast that I'm doing now, the F. Scott Fitzgerald story, The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, which was adapted into a very interesting film that only used that as a jumping off point. It's not quite the same story, but I chose in reading that I kept hearing a man with a southern, like a storyteller with a southern accent. Reading that, as the omniscient voice, and Fitzgerald kind of wrote him that way, almost as a character. It's kind of in the things that he says, the certain choice of words that he uses and the phrases that he chooses. So I started to do that, and I said, this just works great. So that story, the narrator has a southern accent, and he's kind of like the guy sitting on the porch, smoking his cigar, kind of like the Mark Twain kind of character telling the story. And it worked like gangbusters. So I kind of use my intuition as far as that goes. Because it can sometimes be a lot of fun if you go in that direction with the narrator.
I love the idea of starting your podcast with these literary classics. I think that's a great way to start. But what do you hope to achieve?
It's going to be very interesting to see. What my intention is behind it is to bring attention to these very gifted people who could use some help getting people to notice what they're doing. It's just such a cutthroat. I hate to use phrases like cutthroat and dog eat dog. They're so they're violent and negative, But the intense competition. I feel like some people are not being given the opportunities that they deserve. There's a lot of people doing these things. As an actor, I know that a lot of people who call themselves actors, or when I was starting out as a young actor, who considered themselves actors, really were not of the quality that you would want to think of as being someone who should be taking up space in that world,
Okay.
And I know that that's kind of an obnoxious way of stating that, but there are good people, there are mediocre people, there are poor people, and then there are really great people, and those great talents need to be given a voice, somehow, to a leg up, whatever you want to call it. And so if I can do that anyway, that's what I want to do with this podcast. And I'm hoping that maybe these writers will get their stories published more easily in things.
Okay.
Maybe eventually end up with an agent through this. It's going to take a while for word of mouth to build, but that's my hope anyway. Yeah.
Very, very worthy. And who is the audience for the podcast, would you think? Is it writers or is it listeners?
Yeah, right now, I think the writing community is going to be paying closest attention. I think I'm going to be bringing some of the book lovers, from the first version of this podcast over,
Yes.
and they'll be enjoying this, and they've already expressed, interest in it. But initially, I think it's going to be the writing community that's going to be paying the most attention. But, I think eventually, through word of mouth, it's going to kind of bleed over into just book lovers and readers of all sorts who just want to hear a good story. And then the benefit of that is they might learn something about a person that they didn't know about, and then go and seek out other things by this writer. So I'm hoping that it really kind of expands that way, and that we do reach a larger audience. Right now, my full attention is on this podcast, and I have a feeling it's going to remain there for quite some time.
Okay. So how would a listener get this podcast? What's the best place for them to go?
Well, they can get it on all of the major, podcast providing podcast stores, but
Providers,
Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music has the podcasts there. They don't separate this. It's part of Amazon Music, and pretty much anywhere else that you can get a podcast for download. You could also stream it from my website, which is www.shortstorytoday.com. All one word, no underscores or periods in there, shortstorytoday.com. And it's laid out really nicely, so you can listen to the most recent episode, and then if you want to browse through and listen to one of the earlier ones, it's very easy to do that on the website. My first author is a really wonderfully talented and wonderful person, John Henry Fleming, who is a pretty established writer in his own right. He's got an anthology of short stories called Songs for the Deaf, which has been published by Burrow Press. He just finished a young adult novel that they're kind of putting the finishing touches on. And he's taking a sabbatical from his teaching job starting in the fall to complete a novel that he's been working on, which is kind of in your wheelhouse there, Neil. It's an historical fiction, but there's a lot of fantastical elements to it. So you may want to have John on your podcast when that book comes out. He's a professor at the University of Southern Florida and runs the creative writing program.
Oh, right. Yeah, he sounds like a bigwig, as we call them.
Yeah, well, he is certainly a talent, to reckon with, and someone whose work I really want to see that more people start to read. So,
would it be a weekly show then?
Yes, it will be a weekly show. Yes, we'll continue doing the weekly podcast, and I'm still trying to decide, where I want the cutoff to be as far as how long it should be. I've learned with the first version of the podcast that people's attention spans, I don't like to ask people to commit to more than maybe like 40 minutes. So I want to try to hold it to somewhere between 40 and 45 minutes.
One kind of almost final question I wanted to ask you is, I wanted to ask you this because of your experience, not only with reading and performing, but also with your looking as a judge at work, is should authors write to market in the hope of selling more books and getting onto the bestseller list, or should they instead write about things that are meaningful to them? convey their own values and beliefs.
Yeah, I am a firm believer that the minute you start to adjust your work, your creative process and your creative output to try to appease or for approval of a certain kind, I think that's just the kiss of death. I mean, I think the great writers, the classics, everybody of course wants to have a bestseller. Who wouldn't? But if that's what's motivating you, you're in the wrong business.
Yeah.
You need to be writing from a place of love. I mean, for me, the act of creation, it's like the act. I mean, that's why people say this is my baby. About their book. It's comes from a place of love. The best short stories, as I read them, I know right away. I can tell in the first paragraph where this story is coming from. If it's coming from deep down, from the heart, from a place of love, I can tell when a writer is like bearing their soul on the page. That's what gets me.
We're going to have to finish, but we'll finish with things like how can people follow you on Twitter? What's your handle?
It's at Short Story Today, strung together. There are capital letters at the beginning of Short Story and Today. But yeah, that's my Twitter handle. Yep.
Okay. And do you have any other social and media presence?
Yeah,
I follow you on Facebook.
The podcast is on Facebook.
Yeah.
That's at Short Story Today podcast on Facebook. I'm on Instagram, also Short Story Today on Instagram, and on YouTube. Right now, there's nothing much on there. There's one. I put one of the episodes from the classic Short Story Today podcast on there.
Oh, that's good.
But I am going to use that once we start the new podcast to have the video version of the interviews for people to.
Oh, that's interesting.
To watch and to listen to. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you've done a wonderful job, and I commend you on your interviewing skills and field of interest. Has made this a lot of fun in the way of trying to find the places where we overlap and. That's been a real pleasure and a joy. So thank you, Neil.
Well, thank you. Well, congratulations on what sounds like an absolutely fascinating series. And I'm really pleased that you're supporting these authors, which are trying to get their name out into the world. So I'll be following the podcast for sure. And I'll put links on when this goes live. I'll put the links on so other people can follow the podcast as well. Maybe we should really have another meeting in a year's time and see how you're getting on, and you can tell me what you've learned.
I would love that. Now, I'm an atheist, but I do use expressions like God willing. So you too.
I wish you all the love in the world.
You Bye-bye. Too. And I love you and what you're doing. So
thank you.
Keep up the good work.
And you. Bye.
Bye-bye.